One of the standout builds here at SEMA is Hank Iroz's R8 drag car. We're here with Hank to find out a little bit more about what's gone into this build. But Hank, before we get into the R8, let's get a bit of background on your experience in drag racing, which, as I understand, really started in the Audi world. So fill us in on the details.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're kind of known for is the 5-cylinder that's in the TTRS and RS3. And why that's relevant to what we're going to talk about in the R8 is that it's a 5-cylinder. It's basically just half of that V10. So the transmission controller is very, very, very similar to what's in this. In fact, if you pull this thing apart, the part number on the transmission, what we call a MoTeC, which is the valve body, it says DQ500, which is the code for the RS3 transmission. So we gained a lot of experience with the RS3 and that half of this engine to where kind of blending into this R8 world has gone very, very well and a lot easier than probably most people just because we do have that vast experience of RS3.
So essentially take what you knew, worked on the RS3, multiply it by 2 and you're done?
Yeah, it's crazy math. Just multiply everything by 2 and you kind of figure. So I mean, that's where our RS3 program is right now, is right around 1,500 horsepower. We've gone 7s with the RS3, over 175 mile an hour. So if we feel like we can do 1,500 horsepower with one bank of this motor, we're pretty confident that we can get into that 3,000 horsepower range pretty quickly.
I mean, the math is simple, but often math doesn't really check out when we're talking in multiples of horsepower numbers. Okay, so what was the impetus to move from their RS3 platform and play with the big boys in the Audi R8 Huracan market?
Just competition. It's the RS3 world. We're really, really fast. I think we're almost a full second faster than the next RS3 right now. So it's just not very fun chasing ghosts. It's fun to have competition. It's fun to compete against brilliant minds in the industry like Tony Palo and Martin at AMS. And some of these big names are underground racing. There's a lot of brilliant people in there that it's kind of a ego-driven industry. It's fun just to measure yourself against people that have done it for a long time and done a really good job.
And I think that's one of the attractions, at least it was for me with drag racing, is that it doesn't matter where in the world you are, a 400-meter long stretch of drag strip is always the same. So your results here in the US can be weighed up against other parts of the world. And as you say, you can see how you stack up compared to the big players in this market. So yeah, I understand the interest in drag racing. In terms of picking a platform to go for, most people with a bit of an understanding here realize that the Audi R8 and the Lamborghini Huracan kind of share essentially the same platform, engine, etc. Is there anything more to choosing between the two, or just the higher sticker price for the Huracan?
I think that the R8's an interesting price point, but also it's a little longer wheelbase. So, one of the inherent problems when you're drag racing a mid-engine car like this, whether it's an MR2 or anything mid-engine, is you start getting weight transfer where at first it's awesome because you can load up the rear tire and get that weight transfer on the rear, but then you start getting to a point where it just starts wanting to lift the front tires.
And this has been a problem that all of the faster Lamborghinis and Audis are seemingly suffering from looking in from the outside. We're seeing lots of Instagram photos and videos of massive wheelies, which is impressive, but not necessarily fast.
Yeah, you definitely don't want wheelies if you're trying to go fast. The internet loves them, but the time slips usually suffer for that. When we're having to pull back power in second and third gear well past the 330 mark on a stock engine car, that's an indicator that there's just not enough weight forward. There's too much weight transfer to the rear, and the pivot point, which is the rear axle, there's too much weight behind it. So while it's really easy to put the turbos behind the axle because there's these nice, beautiful headers that the factory gives you, and there's a ton of room back there where the mufflers used to go, it's pretty much the worst place you could stick turbos if you're trying to keep the front end down.
So that leads us on to the thought process for this build. As you mentioned, there's a nice convenient spot that Audi/Lamborghini have left that's really just crying out for a couple of turbos to be jammed there.
Yeah.
But as you say, I mean, that weight is literally right at the rear extreme of the car. However, that's what we've seen everyone do because it's easy, it's the way that someone's done it, so everyone else has sort of followed on that same sort of trajectory. You've gone a very different way with this particular car. So talk us through what you are trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, the big emphasis with the car is just getting weight forward. We want to change the balance of the car. I think the factory car is like 56% of the weight is over the rear axle and 44 is over the front. So we're pretty close to 50-50 now. And you know, the GT4 R8 is a little more unique than the road car just because it's a factory race car, and so it needs to put up with road racing and, you know, endurance racing. So it has a lot more cooling than the factory car. It has a huge front mount radiator, which led me to believe that I probably could get rid of the side mount coolers and just rely on the front radiator for the very small amounts of time we're running, and hopefully 6 seconds or 10 seconds at a time if we're half miling. So that's a big emphasis.
Let's just come back a little bit because there's a bunch of subtle aspects there. So you've mentioned GT4 race car.
Yeah.
So this didn't start as a road car. This is Audi's FIA homologated GT4 race car.
Yep.
This is for road racing. This is a class that exists out there. Seems like an interesting choice when building up a drag car, starting out with a factory-built GT4 race car. How did that pan out?
Well, it's a lot of you know, just looking at the hardware that the GT4s get compared to the road car, the price point. I mean, they're similar money, but for us, I'm quite fond of life and family and all that, and I wanted a really good safety. And so the GT4s come with a proper cage that wasn't designed in somebody's shop. They give you the FEA analysis on the cage with the documentation of the car. It's designed to hit walls at a really fast speed. So it's got full fire suppression, which I don't really want to be burned. So that was a big deal as well. You started adding up what the car had. It made sense to use that as the start point. And even the aero, I doubt we'll race with the wing on the rear. But, you know, if you're trying to keep the front end down at the 330 mark, we're already doing well over, you know, 130 miles an hour. Having front aero to keep the front end down is kind of a big deal.
And I think it's really easy to overlook the importance of safety, but with these cars sort of knocking on the 200 plus mile an hour point, you know, if things go wrong, that there's a lot of potential harm that's going to come from that. And as you mentioned, also the fire suppression system is nice to have. These cars can catch fire when things go wrong, and you know, you do have to put some emphasis on your safety there. This cage, as you mentioned, it's a proper FIA homologated cage. Audi have gone to slightly more length than probably most of the workshops turning out cage kits for these cars are likely to do so. Was there anything that you needed to strip out or remove from the GT4 package? I mean, obviously you've talked about that rear wing.
The saddest thing we had to take out was the air jacks. So like, air jacks are pretty cool. It would have been pretty neat to have the air jacks functional, but you know, this car is converted to all-wheel drive. We've just used the road car parts because they were rear-wheel drive in the GT4 series, but the air jack on the front goes right where the diff goes.
That would be hard to come back from, I imagine.
Yeah, so we may relocate it later because the idea of being on staging lines with tire warmers on air jacks is pretty cool. But so we took out some of that, but the GT4 got some other stuff that's kind of relevant. You know, the carbon tub that they use is significantly reinforced from the stock car for the pickup points for the cage and all that. We recently just shot that Jim Nakana Ken Block's video here in Las Vegas. So that car, they used our workshop as the base. So it's cool because we got to rub shoulders with a lot of like the president of Audi Sport.
Nice.
And so like they were looking at the car and just like blown away. And once I started mentioning why we wanted to use the car, they like got over the blasphemy of turning a car that turns into a drag car. Hopefully she just got all of her turns out of her system. When turning at this point is not a good, we don't want to turn no more.
Just at the end of the drag strip to get back down the return lane. All right, let's talk about the turbo package. So as you've already alluded to there, you've designed this to move the turbochargers forward, which is pretty apparent there. We can see at least on the right hand side of the car, one of the Xona Rotor turbos kind of making its presence fairly well known. Challenges of doing that, you already mentioned removing the heat exchangers, but any other challenges with doing that, or is there still plenty of room to work with compared to rear mount? It's
really tight, and you know, one of the other reasons why we really wanted the turbos here is just ease to get to the transmission. You know, with your turbos on the rear bumper, you're having to kind of disassemble turbo kits every time the transmission comes out, and while the parts are increasing in strength in the transmission world, it's still a fairly common item to have to pluck out of the car. And that was a huge emphasis for us, is just trying to figure out how to get the transmissions in and out more quickly. And to where if you brought a spare transmission to a track, could you get it pulled out quickly enough to make a difference in the race or anything like that? And I think that's helped it a lot. Negatives, Dumping exhaust out the side like that is not super advantageous for aerodynamics. You know, you kind of create this big side draft that slows the car down.
No easy way to get them to the rear of the car?
It would be hard. You know, we may do an iteration if we find that it's, you know, too much, but you see that every once in a while. Like I'm sure you've seen like the Ecanu Supra, but they battled that for a long time, of the exhaust going out the side on a 2JZ, and it would push up against the wall.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they'd look at data logs, and the car's actually going through the traps, somewhat of a slip angle in the sideways, because there's so much force against the wall. So that's not ideal. You know, we may make some effort to get the exhaust out the rear in the future, but for now, we just really wanted to you know, see what kind of pressure we can build with an inlet that sees positive pressure with ram air and all that.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect, because that wouldn't be normal with these platforms, correct?
No, correct. I mean, we've put pressure transducers on the rear bumpers on the inlets and stuff, and it's less than ambient on the turbo inlet.
So you're starting from the back foot right away.
It's just a huge low pressure zone off the rear bumper. That's pretty much the worst place to pull fresh air off of, is the rear bumper of a car.
Let's just talk about that in terms of how that affects the turbocharger without going too sort of techie here. You know, we think of boost pressure, and that's what we measure in the inlet manifold, which the engine cares about. But as far as the turbo is concerned, it's actually the pressure ratio across the compressor. So tell us what that is and how that low pressure area actually influences pressure ratio.
Yeah, inlet pressure is super important from a pressure ratio standpoint. I mean, I think a lot of people, even, you know, notable shops, probably don't have people that understand pressure ratios. But you know, when you're multiplying your base pressure by 3, 4, 5 times, some cases, you know, drops in inlet pressure become very, 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 very important, both for efficiency and just for maximum corrected flow. And how much air can you pump out? You know, so if you're dropping 10 kPa off of the inlet pressure and you're trying to multiply that 4 times, you're ending up with a lot less corrected flow than you would if you were starting at an ambient sea level. It's, you know, basically by having the turbos on the rear bumper, you're racing at 2,500 feet of elevation all the time, which I understand why it's done, and, you know, we're happy to do it on, you know, less competitive cars. But if we're trying to make, you know, if we're trying to carve out a record or trying to go after that last little percent that, you know, leaders in our industry have gained, then having inlet pressure be positive or at least ambient starts to become a really big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that pressure ratio, we'll see that on the vertical axis of a compressor map. So really it's that defines whereabouts we're operating on the compressor map, not the pressure in the inlet manifold, which is what everyone sort of considers.
Everybody focuses on that intake manifold, but, you know, I think people that live at elevation or have poor conditions start to understand pressure ratios a lot sooner than people that are used to racing at sea level. Because you just start to see how much, you know, we go to World Cup finals, which is this weekend. We went last year for the first time with an RS3, and we were humbled because I just had never experienced negative 2,000 DA in my life. Like, turbos are making 15 pounds of boost more than they would in Las Vegas or even at sea level. Yeah. So you start to understand if you can get positive pressure into stuff, it is a huge deal.
All right, let's talk about the specifics of the turbo, because I've already spied the numbering on the side of it doesn't actually seem to exist at the moment on the Xona Rotor website. So
yeah.
You got some special super secret prototype turbos?
Yeah, so like Xona Rotor, we use a lot of them, and I think some of it is just our really close relationship with the ownership and the engineering department over there. But what I like about Xona Rotor is they're willing and able to do niche turbos. Like, these turbos were just basically designed around a really highly efficient V10 that revs to almost 10,000 RPM. It doesn't need a lot of pressure. So a turbo that works really well for a 4G63, something that's just crazy high boost, isn't going to work very well here. So, you know,
So they want a turbocharger or a compressor that is designed to be super efficient at high mass flows, but not necessarily super high pressure ratios.
Correct. So like some of the tricks that you use in turbochargers to achieve that is, you know, messing with the ported shroud, you know, how you're sneaking air in past the inducer of the compressor. I mean, if it's too big, you start getting into these violent surge issues, but on a 4G63 that has to boost to 70, 80 PSI to be competitive, that's a big deal. But for us, we can make that ported shroud very, very aggressive because we're not having to, if we throw 40 or 50 pounds of boost at this in the mid-range, we'll see gears scattered all over the track. So it's not really important for us.
On that note, sort of what boost pressures, I mean, we say low boost, but I mean, it's all relative to a baseline. What sort of boost pressure are you expecting to be running in this once you've got it dialed in and you're starting to beat on it?
My guess is we'll end up somewhere under the 4-to-1 pressure ratio. So probably in that 40 to 42 pounds of boost, we'll make close to 3,000 horsepower.
And, I mean, this really comes down to the fact that in comparison to the other big players in the market, the likes of the Nissan GT-R, you've got capacity and you've got a cylinder count on your side. So you've got a large capacity engine with good volumetric efficiency, so it doesn't require massive amounts of boost to see 3,000 horsepower.
Yeah, that's accurate. I mean, even the 5-cylinder, you see, we struggle with the 5-cylinder with really big turbos just because you still have to figure out how to get them off the line, and it's a little tricky to get that done. But, a motor like this where you have 5.2 liters, it probably doesn't need more than 900, 1,000 Newton meters on the line, and you can achieve that with 7 or 8 pounds of boost. It doesn't need a whole lot. So some of those design considerations for turbos of surge lines and high pressure ratios to be efficient, like that doesn't really apply here. So, why would we use a turbo that's designed for that? And that's the cool part about Xona Rotor. This is their new X5C. It's designed around a V10. Okay. And we've made a smaller version of it for stock motor cars. It's a 67 millimeter inducer. It's roughly the same aerodynamics, but it's the same thing. We went 7s on that turbo on 67s. It's kind of unheard of. But we did it just because we were able to do really, really, really low pressure ratios and flow a lot of mass flow.
In terms of getting that power to the track, I'm assuming, though, you're still going to be ramping that boost pressure in as the car goes down the track. So how are you doing this? Is this just through the engine management in terms of torque requests, or are you running gear or speed-dependent boost, or a combination of all of the above?
Yeah, so this is like a MoTeC car, and we lean heavily on a few metrics. Shaft speed, turbo shaft speed. You notice that all the turbos have shaft speeds on them. But most of what we do is torque management through the throttle position, through throttle input. That's kind of how the OEM works as far as trying to get torque management and all that going. And what they'll use is it's like a reservoir concept where the throttle plate is kind of the regulator of torque, and you want more pressure pre-throttle than you want post-throttle, because if you have a dip in torque and you need torque, you can just open the throttle and have access to more pressure or more flow. Where, back in the day, even like the RS3s, a lot of that stuff, we're just doing it off boost by gear and stuff like that, but it's not a perfect way of controlling torque. The OEM model where you have a reservoir of airflow that can be opened if you open the throttles is super powerful. You start looking at logs, and the throttles are just doing this the whole time, just trying to maintain a torque level. And MoTeC does that very, very well.
And that also allows more quicker and more linear modulation for the driver. So essentially the relationship between the driver's foot pedal position and what the engine's producing feels more linear?
Absolutely. And that's where, the driver can't feel that the throttle positions are varying 25-30%. But it's funny, like back in the day, remember when like throttle bodies started coming out drive-by-wire, everyone's like, oh, they're so slow, like the response is terrible. Like
we still have that debate today. People genuinely think that drive-by-wire throttles are slower than cable. So
yeah,
suffice to say, not the case.
Yeah, servos are really, really fast, and it's an awesome way of controlling boost and controlling. If we want to run under spring pressure, we can with that strategy. You just close the throttles to where it just chokes them off. So, you're somewhat restricting the engine output, much like they do in competitive leagues with restrictors. You're just saying, well, we know how much power it makes if we have to squeeze it through a dime-size hole. So it's the same concept. But yeah, just a lot of good torque management. GPS, 100 hertz GPS, trying to look at wheel speed versus actual road speed to try to figure out, are the tires spinning, or is there a discrepancy between GPS and tires spinning?
There's an interesting comment you've made there. This is something that's been talked about for a number of years, using a GPS input for the likes of active traction control. And obviously the usual consumer grade 10 hertz GPS is just physically not fast enough, but now we're seeing 50 hertz and, as you mentioned, 100 hertz GPS. So can you integrate that for traction control?
Absolutely, yeah.
And are you?
We are, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're spot on. I mean, for the longest time, 50 hertz was military grade. You just couldn't get a hold of it or get satellites to support it. But like there's a new Bosch chip that supports up to 100 hertz, and that's so much data. I mean, you can do really good traction control with that. And then like this car has all suspension set up for looking at pot position for suspension travel, so we can start looking at how much downforce is the front adding at speed. Do we need to take more wing out of the front to keep the front end down? Do we need more in the rear? You can start to see what the aerodynamics are doing with the car when you have pots for linear position for shock position and all of that.
All right, Hank, you've only just got the car up and running. It's driven into SEMA under its own power, but as I understand it, really hasn't seen the dyno in any anger yet. Once you've got it dialed in, and I mean, it's obviously a hard question to answer, but can you give us some insight? What are we chasing here in terms of ET and mile an hour?
Yeah, so we think that this car has enough in it to do sixes eventually. It probably will take a little while. We're going to probably catch up on some work here in the next couple of months because we've been hammering on this thing pretty hard. But I expect the beginning of the year we'll have this thing mid-sevens, and we'll start chipping away at that. If it doesn't go 200 miles an hour by January, I'll be pretty disappointed. But ultimately, I think it's a car that you can trap 215, 220 in the quarter. And we think that the car can also do 240, 250 in the half mile. So that's kind of the effort of the car, is just trying to make sure it's safe enough to go that fast, and where we feel like we're not just putting our lives at risk to chase numbers. And then just using out of the box engineering to what we know about physics and Newton's laws to figure out if we can make the car faster than anybody else has gone. So. Well,
you've certainly taken an out-of-the-box approach with the turbo location, and it's a work of art. We look forward to seeing how it goes once it hits the drag strip, and best of luck chasing down those sixes.
Yeah, we sure appreciate it. We love the content. You guys do a really good job, so we appreciate you educating the community of stuff like pressure ratios and tuning and stuff like that, because it's definitely a lot of misinformation out there, so it's fun when we hear it on a big stage like what you guys do. So keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.
If you like that video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and if you're not already a subscriber, make sure you're subscribed. We release a new video every week. And if you like free stuff, we've got a great deal for you. Click the link in the description to claim your free spot to our next live lesson.